Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with the hottest in budget deck technology. And for today's deck tech, we are continuing our in-depth look at Tarkir Dragonstorm as we highlight each week one of the 5 clans that exist on the plane. So, without further ado, join me today in the Explorer format for a deck that I am calling Temur Landfall. Longtime viewers of the channel know how we do it. We have to talk about the stats of the deck before we dive right in. So our Temur Landfall deck, as the name suggests, means we're going to be rocking blue, red, and green. We're looking at a little higher than average mana curve, about 2.8, and we're going to be rocking 12 creatures, 4 instants, 10 sorceries, 6 enchantments, and 28 lands. Our landfall deck today may look very spicy and atypical of what you may be used to, and what I mean by that is we're going to hopefully just try to ramp out for days as much as possible. And once we have enough lands on the battlefield, we're going to try to utilize a single spell that we're going to need to then copy every one of our enchantments and even some of our creatures and lands to hopefully just create a giant board state which will overwhelm our opponent with the amount of dragon tokens we can build. If that doesn't work for whatever reason, plan B to the deck is we can just copy a bunch of crabs and just kind of mill out our opponent with the insane amount of tokens we will be able to just put onto the battlefield. But regardless of however we get to victory, you may be asking yourself right now, how do we pull this off on such a janky pile and only utilizing 12 rares total for the budget?
Good question.
Well, I'm glad you asked. So as always, let's not waste any more time and let's just jump right into it and show you what I'm talking about. Starting with the creatures in our deck, in the 1-drop slot we will have Ruin Crab here. It has the landfall ability that reads, whenever a land we control enters, each opponent has to mill 3 cards. This will of course get our game plan going, and also can be a nice pseudo plan B if you will to the deck. However, in order to synergize with this ability, we'll also utilize Aftermath Analyst. When this creature enters, we mill 3 cards. However, its secondary ability is what we really enjoy. For 4 mana, we could sacrifice the Analyst and then return all land cards from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped, which as you can kind of figure out right now, with this and the crab out, we can then get a ton of milling going against our opponent. However, we will need, of course, a couple of lands to get into the graveyard, so we will have in the 3-drop slot here, Spring Broom Druid. So the Druid here, when it enters, we have to sacrifice a land, but if we do, we could search our library for up to 2 basic land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So this is also kind of pseudo ramp, but also we'll get a couple of lands into the graveyard, which of course will trigger off with Ruin Crab and Aftermath Analyst once we get that whole little combo package going. For the non-creatures in our deck that will provide for us a little extra support here, we'll utilize here Glacial Dragon Hunt. It allows us to draw a card and we can discard a card. However, if you discard a non-land card this way, you can deal 3 damage to target creature. Keep in mind, you don't have to actually discard a card. This is just again one of those additional things if you need it in a pinch. However, this card also has the Harmonize ability, so let's actually talk about that on this card for just a moment. So on this card specifically, it says Harmonize for 6. In other words, you may cast this card from our graveyard for 6 mana, and you can tap a creature we control to reduce that cost of generic mana by X, where X is the creature's power, then you get to exile the spell. So if you're not totally confused what that means, in other words, think of this as basically the flashback mechanic with one extra step, where we can tap down a creature to make it a cheaper card when we recast it from our graveyard. We're also going to utilize here Growth Spiral here to simply draw a card and put a land card from our hand onto the battlefield. And then one of our other big spells here is going to be Doppelgang. I actually love what this card can do here. For X amount that you want to pay, you can make a bunch of extra copies of anything on the battlefield. This can also be lands. This can also be your opponent's stuff.
That is awesome.
So actually, this is a very flexible card once you have enough mana out. So ideally, try to at least get at least 8 or more mana to get more value out of this card. You definitely do not want to cast this for just 5 mana, just an FYI for you. And in the 5-drop slot here, we'll also utilize your Mammoth Bellow. This is a sorcery speed token producer where we can make a 5/5 green elephant creature token for 5 mana. It also has Harmonize for 8 if you want to make another copy of another elephant. However, the biggest stars in our whole game plan here are going to be our enchantments. So let's talk about those briefly for just a moment, starting with Frostcliff Siege. So this is a 3 mana enchantment that reads, as this enchantment enters, you can choose Jeskai or Temur. If you choose Jeskai, whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. If you choose Temur, creatures you control will get +1/+0 and have trample and haste. In a perfect world, you ideally want to be able to have 2 copies of this out so you can both draw cards and also get a lot of hasty trampling creatures to put additional pressure on your whole opponent's game plan. However, the real big star of the show that's going to really bring this whole deck together and can be hilarious if you copy it with Doppelgang is going to be Dragonback Assault. So, same thing, let's talk about this card briefly for a moment. This is a 6 mana enchantment that reads, when this enchantment enters, it deals 3 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. And with the landfall ability, whenever a land we control enters, create a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying. So, if we can again copy this with Doppelgang here, you can get a ton of extra copies out here. You can wrath out your whole opponent's board, and then once you have a couple of extra lands out, you can just make tokens, and that should be hopefully enough in the air to just smash your way to victory. As far as your land base is concerned, it's of course going to be as simple as possible. However, we do want to have a little bit higher of a land count than normal because of all the high mana stuff we're definitely going to want to cast. So we'll be utilizing 7 islands, 5 mountains, and 7 forests. As far as the fetch lands, we're going to be utilizing the instant ones because several of our cards will just put cards onto the battlefield instantly. So that means we definitely want to make sure that we can just keep getting more value with landfall triggers. So we'll be throwing in copies of Broker's Hideout, Cabaret Courtyard, and Maestro's Theater to round out our package. If you're interested in playing this in best of 3, here's what I would recommend for you for the sideboard. So, you can have a counterspell in Stubborn Denial here, which also with the Ferocious ability, if we control a creature of power 4 or greater, we simply can counter a spell for just 1 mana. Spitfire Lock here, since we are technically a landfall deck, we can throw this out here if we just want to burn out our opponent once we make a bunch of extra land drops, and also we can copy those land drops with Doppelgang. If we want to make sure our creatures and our enchantments do not get counterspelled, we can bring in Destiny Spinner here to help us out with that. Also, we do have a lot of extra lands, so her secondary ability may come in handy in a pinch, where we can turn a target land we control into a giant elemental creature with trample and haste until end of turn. For our artifact and enchantment hate, we'll throw in Heritage Reclamation, and then for additional sieges, we'll also throw in Glacierwood Siege here, just a single copy of this. We can choose either Temur or Sultai. If we choose the Temur side, we can then mill our opponent for even more value, and for the Sultai side, we can then also play lands from our graveyard. We're also, of course, going to throw in some Temur Charms here, just again for flavor purposes, because why not? But speaking of also flavor, we'll also utilize here the brand new Legendary Spirit Dragon here, Ureni, the Song Unending. So this 8 mana 10/10 Spirit Dragon also has protection from white and black, and also when it enters, you can deal X damage divided as you choose among any number of creatures and or planeswalkers our opponent controls, where X is the number of lands we control. So this of course goes really well with our whole landfall package. With the deck tech out of the way, here's tips and tricks I can give you to get the most value out of the deck. So in the early part of the game, you are most likely going to start ramping as much as possible and as fast as you can. In a perfect world, it would be Growth Spiral into Springbloom Druid into Dragonback Assault by turn 4, but don't always assume that you're going to get to that level that easily. However, that's the reason why we have other cards that are going to support our package, which are Frostcliff Siege, for example. You can utilize that to then choose either Jeskai to help draw some more cards if you can just get some cheap damage in with your Springbloom Druid, or maybe your Aftermath Analyst. Or if you need to, and just put a little more pressure on your opponent, or you can pick the Temur side if you know for sure you're going to start making a bunch of dragons after Dragonback Assault hits the battlefield. Mammoth Bellow actually can harmonize into itself, so if you're able to do that, that actually can provide you a little bit of extra support by putting out some big creature tokens to kind of help chump block for the time being until you can start getting your army of dragons out. If you can get a turn 1 Ruin Crab out, that's perfectly fine, but actually the card is much better once you have an established board state of enough lands, so this way once your Ruin Crab comes out, you can sometimes even copy it with Doppelgang along with Dragonback Assault, make a ton of extra copies, and then just do a massive mill against your opponent. Speaking of Doppelgang, you ideally don't want to start using it until you at least have 8 mana on the battlefield. Anything beyond that is just gravy for you, but the sweet number is going to be 8. Anything less than that, and you're only going to get one copy of only one thing, which most of the time is not really worth the value. The only exception to that is if you're in a sticky situation where you might have to sometimes copy an opponent's creature, maybe a Shieldred or something else that'll prevent your opponent from getting through their damage. Finally, if you do need to in a pinch, you can also bring back your other lands with your Aftermath Analyst. This will bring back, of course, even all the immediate sack lands, which can give you a ton of extra triggers if you have a couple of extra Ruin Crabs out, or again, Dragonback Assault. One of these two cards is going to be your key to victory, whether you feel safe to just mill out your opponent, or again, make that giant army of dragons. This of course now leads us to the biggest advantage this deck has. We more often than not don't really care about what our opponent is trying to do on the battlefield. Once you can get at least one Dragonback Assault, you should be able to wrath away if they have a go wide strategy, or if you do manage to make a couple of green elephant creature tokens, those will of course help put pressure against your opponent while you start establishing everything else you need to do. With the sack lands that you have, this of course gives you another major extra advantage because all of those sack lands also give you a little bit of incremental life gain. 1 life point may not seem like much, but it will hopefully add up just enough to sponge a couple extra hits as you keep establishing your board state. This of course leads us to the major disadvantage this deck has. While we do have an advantage of just ramping out a ton of lands, unless if you can get at least 1 chump blocker out, whether it's an Aftermath Analyst, a Spring Blue Druid, or even a Ruin Crab, until you can get out that Dragonback Assault, your deck doesn't really get a chance to do much of anything. So you're going to have to hold down the fort as best as you can, utilizing those or your spot removal with Glacier Dragon Hunt until you actually can get established the rest of your game plan. If your opponent is able to counterspell or sometimes destroy your enchantments, then your deck is going to feel very sad because you won't get a chance to do much of anything. So be mindful of that. To this end, I will also emphasize not only counterspells will hurt your Dragonback Assault, but they also will hit your Doppelgang, especially because it's a high risk and high reward kind of strategy. If you are going to be tapping out just to get the maximum amount of value of Doppelgang, try to ideally do it if you know your opponent does not have an answer to it. But of course, that's easier said than done, really depending on what type of deck your opponent is throwing at you. And the other final weakness, of course, to the deck is, although we do have several ways of course ramping out, sometimes this deck will feel like it kind of just runs out of gas. Yes, you do have Growth Spirals and Glacial Dragon Hunts to help churn through your deck and draw into more action, but there will be some moments where you could keep drawing and you might not actually hit your land drops on time, which will make the deck feel extremely slow and very, very clunky. But of course, with all that said, if you still like what the strategy does and you've made it this far into the video, you of course are my true fiery friends. And because of that, stick around for a little bit longer because I'm about to show you right now how you can take this deck to the next level if you're willing to invest a little bit more in terms of rares and mythics. But before we continue, if you do like any of the content that I do, please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you watch the content. You can support me monthly for a small amount on Patreon where I have all of my extended bonus footage posted. We also have a Redbubble spot where you can buy merch like stickers and shirts, or for free, all you can just do also is just join our growing community on Discord. Your support helps keep this channel going. All links are in the details below. Now, in terms of upgrades for the deck, here's what I would recommend for you to get more value out of it. So if you're willing to invest the extra rares and mythics, you can then add in copies of Lotus Cobra here. This is a great card for us because its landfall ability is perfectly synergistic with our game plan. While the mana it'll provide for us as we get more triggers off will be temporary, we can still use it hopefully to then just ramp out even faster to make sure we can get a step ahead of our opponent. In the 3-drop slot here, we may need a little extra backup besides Dragonback Assault for those tokens, so another way we can make a bunch of tokens is going to be Scoot Swarm here. Man, I love what this card can do. Anytime we have a land enter, we could create an insect creature token. If we have 6 or more lands already, we can create copies of the Scoot Swarm. I don't think I have to even remind you guys, if you've seen my channel long enough, that I've definitely used this card many times in the past, so be sure to check out those videos if you haven't already, and I'll of course leave links if you haven't already noticed throughout the course of this video. In terms of other support for our package here, we'll also use Courser Crewfix here. We can play with the top card of our library revealed, and we can play lands from the top of our library. With the landfall ability this has, we have to gain 1 life every time a land enters, which is great for us for stabilization purposes. And then the final card that's going to help us round out our whole package and does a little bit of everything is going to be Prime Evil Bounty. This 6-mana enchantment allows us to either create beast tokens anytime we cast a creature spell. If we cast a non-creature spell, we get to put 3+1/+1 counters on a creature we control. And finally, with the landfall ability this has, we can also gain 3 life. Now, in terms of upgrading, of course, the land base here, it won't be too heavy because we still want to make sure we can hit our basics with our instant sack Capenna lands. We'll use a copy of the World Tree to fix all of our mana to what we need. We'll have 3 copies of Ketria Triome, and of course the Surveil lands of Hedge Maze, Commercial District, and Thundering Falls. And then finally, as far as the upgrades to your sideboard, realistically you can kind of play with whatever, but I would recommend for you Valakut Exploration. We can bring these in if we're dealing with more control packages out there and we want to be less about the token game plan, so this can hopefully just help us dig a bunch of cards deep, and any cards we don't use, we can simply just burn out our opponent on the spot. Otherwise, the other major upgrades for the deck are going to be Roar of the Endless Song here. So for this saga, we could trade 2 5/5 green elephant creature tokens over the first 2 turns, and the final turn allows us to double the power and toughness of each creature we control until end of turn, which is a fantastic splashy way to finish off our opponent. And then of course the other final change is going to be a copy of Genesis Ultimatum here. If we can have this go off with all the mana that we have, we could look at the top 5 cards of our library and put any number of permanents we control from among them onto the battlefield and the rest into our hand, which is a massive way to make sure we can easily just recover even if our opponent blows up everything on the battlefield. And with that all out of the way, here are my final thoughts that I want to give on this deck. Overall, we played quite a few landfall decks over the course of this channel, but I would probably say thanks to Dragonback Assault alone, this is probably the most explosive version I have ever played of any of our landfall decks, mainly because that card is a literal game changer against any opponents out there who think they might get the upper hand against us in a landfall deck. But to put this another way, if you're a fan of the Temur colors, if you're a fan of making a ton of tokens, and if you're a fan of the landfall ability that allows us to have the flexibility of either milling out our opponent or again just blowing up the whole board while making a ton of dragons, then I would definitely say give this deck a try. And I assure you, once you manage to get out a couple of key enchantments that'll help just blow up your opponent's board and also make a ton of tokens, you're gonna have a lot of fun doing so, and you'll be very surprised at how you can pull that off on today's budget. You will definitely not be disappointed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later.